The auctioneer didn't bother raising his voice anymore. 37 goats, he called, glancing across the small crowd gathered beneath the faded canvas awning. Who'll give $10? Silence. The goats huddled together inside the rough wooden pen. Their coats were patchy from neglect, their ribs visible beneath dusty hides. Several were too weak to compete for the small pile of hay scattered in the corner. One elderly rancher spat into the dirt. They're finished. Another folded his arms. Feed him for a week and you'll lose more than they're worth. The auctioneer sighed. $5. Still nothing. The July sun hung mercilessly over Cedar Bluff, Wyoming territory. Weeks of relentless heat had burned the surrounding grasslands into shades of pale gold. Every rancher in attendance had come hoping for bargains, but no one wanted animals that looked closer to death than recovery. The auctioneer rubbed the back of his neck. $2 for the whole lot. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Not because it was funny, because it was hopeless. Near the back stood Thaddeus Mercer. Most people simply called him Thad. At 41, he had the weathered face of a man who had worked more seasons than he cared to count. His dark beard carried the first streaks of gray, and his hat had been patched so many times that even the stitching had begun to fade. He studied the goats without speaking. Not the crowd. The goats. One young doe struggled to her feet before carefully nudging another weaker animal toward the shade. A small buck limped, but still tried to protect the others whenever strangers approached. Thad noticed something the rest of the crowd never bothered to see. They're still fighting, he murmured. Silas Penroe, the retired rancher running the sale, overheard him. Fighting what? To stay alive. Silas chuckled sadly. They've lost that fight. Thad shook his head. No. He reached into his pocket and placed $2 silver on the auction table. I'll take them. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then the laughter returned, louder than before. You just bought 37 funerals. Another rancher grinned. Should have saved your money for a shovel. Someone else added. Guess loneliness finally made Mercer lose his senses. Thad ignored every word. He climbed into the pen instead. Slowly, patiently. He crouched beside the weakest goat and offered his canteen. Not forcing, simply waiting. After nearly a minute, the little doe cautiously drank. A faint smile crossed his face. They're thirsty, he said quietly. Not dying. The journey home took nearly 3 hours. Thad refused to rush the herd. Whenever one animal lagged behind, he stopped the entire group rather than forcing them onward. His ranch wasn't large. Just over 100 acres of rocky pasture bordering Cottonwood Ridge. Most neighboring ranchers considered the land unsuitable for cattle because the soil was thin and summer grasses disappeared quickly. But goats noticed things cattle ignored. The moment they reached the property, Thad didn't lead them toward the empty corral. Instead, he opened several smaller grazing paddocks one at a time. Each held different native plants. Wild sage, mountain clover, low-growing yarrow, brush growing between scattered limestone outcrops. He watched carefully. Within minutes, the goats ignored the hay stacked nearby. Instead, they wandered toward the rocky hillside, nibbling plants that most ranchers considered weeds. Thad removed a small notebook from his vest pocket. He scribbled 3 words. Preferred hillside forage. The next morning brought unexpected company. A wagon stopped outside the ranch gate just after sunrise. A woman climbed down carrying 2 wooden milk pails and a leather satchel. She wore a simple blue traveling dress beneath a practical canvas apron, her sleeves rolled neatly to her elbows despite the early hour. Her auburn hair was pinned beneath a straw hat, though several loose strands escaped in the breeze. She introduced herself with a friendly smile. Muriel Sorel. Thad tipped his hat. Morning. I've been visiting ranches around the territory. What for? I'm teaching dairy preservation. He raised an eyebrow. That's a long journey. She laughed softly. It is. Especially when people keep telling me women shouldn't understand cheese better than ranchers. That earned the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. She noticed the goats grazing across the hillside. So the rumors were true. What rumors? That someone actually paid money for Penrose's herd. They're healthier than people think. Muriel studied the animals. You may be right. Most visitors laughed. She observed. That immediately earned Thad's respect. Over the next week, neighbors stopped by almost daily. Not to help, to watch. They leaned against fences with amused expressions. One afternoon, Marshal Gideon Pike rode over. You expecting trouble? No. Then why's everyone gathering outside your pasture? Thad looked toward the road where 3 wagons had already stopped. They're waiting. For what? For me to fail. The marshal chuckled. You mind? I've gotten used to spectators. Gideon watched the goats for several minutes. They do seem stronger. They're choosing different forage every day. What does that mean? I don't know yet. But I'm listening. Muriel returned twice that week. Together, they began recording simple observations. Which plants the goats favored. How often they drank. How quickly their coats improved. She was surprised by Thad's patience. You don't seem eager to milk them. They aren't ready. Most ranchers would have started already. Most ranchers are thinking about next week. He looked toward the recovering herd. I'm thinking about next year. She wrote that sentence in her notebook. It was worth remembering. By late August, the transformation had become impossible to ignore. The weakest goats now climbed rocky hills with surprising confidence. Their coats shone beneath the summer sun. Milk production began slowly, only enough for small experiments. Inside the old smokehouse behind the cabin, Thad converted a storage room into a tiny creamery. Simple shelves, stone walls, cool air, nothing fancy. Muriel joined him after finishing lessons in town. Their first batch failed. Too soft. The second cracked while aging. The third developed an unpleasant bitterness. Neither grew discouraged. Each failure became another page of notes. Another lesson. Another adjustment. One warm evening, as the sun settled behind Cottonwood Ridge, they uncovered a small wheel that had been resting quietly for several weeks. Muriel pressed gently against its surface. It held. Thad sliced into it carefully. The interior was smooth, firm, cream-colored. She tasted the first piece. Her eyes widened. This isn't ordinary goat cheese. He sampled it himself. Rich, nutty, balanced. Nothing like the sharp flavors he'd expected. Just then, a hot gust of late summer wind swept through the open doorway. The cheese remained perfectly firm. Neither of them realized it yet. But that small wheel resting on the wooden table would soon become the beginning of something that would change not only Thad's ranch, but the future of Cedar Bluff itself. By the time September arrived, people were no longer driving past Thad Mercer's ranch just to laugh. Now they slowed down because they were curious. The goats that had looked ready for the knacker's yard only weeks earlier were grazing confidently across the rocky hillsides. Their coats had filled out, their eyes were bright, and the nervous shuffling that had once marked the herd had disappeared. What puzzled the neighboring ranchers most wasn't that the goats had survived. It was that they seemed to be thriving on land no one else wanted. One afternoon, Silas Penroe rode through the ranch gate. The old auctioneer removed his hat as he stared across the hillside. I'll admit something, he said. I figured I'd never see a single one of those animals alive again. Thad smiled, without looking up from repairing a pasture gate. They surprised me too. Silas shook his head. No, they surprised all of us. Inside the small stone creamery behind the barn, another experiment was underway. Rows of wooden shelves held neat rounds of aging cheese, each marked with a charcoal number and a date. Muriel Sorel carefully checked the humidity inside the room, while Thad adjusted a small window that allowed cool evening air to circulate through the thick stone walls. You've become particular, she teased. I've become careful. There's a difference? There should be. She laughed. Most people rush success. I'd rather understand it. Over the previous month, they had produced nearly 20 small wheels. Some were too soft. Others became dry around the edges. One developed tiny cracks after an unusually hot afternoon. Every failure ended up in a notebook rather than the trash. Each mistake taught them something. The successful wheels shared one thing in common. The milk always came from goats that spent most of their day grazing the rocky northern slope. Muriel spread several pages across the work table. The herbs. You think so? I think they matter. Thad nodded thoughtfully. The limestone too. And your slower aging process. He smiled. So maybe the goats deserve more credit than we do. Word of the unusual cheese eventually reached the organizers of the High Prairie Agricultural Fair. Every autumn, ranchers gathered to display livestock, preserves, quilts, leatherwork, and produce from across the territory. Winning even a small ribbon often meant new customers. Muriel looked up from the invitation. You should enter. Thad nearly laughed. Against professional dairies? Against whoever shows up. I've made cheese for less than 2 months. You've made something no one else has. He wasn't convinced, but she was. 3 weeks later, they loaded one carefully wrapped cheese wheel into the wagon and traveled into town before sunrise. The fairgrounds buzzed with activity. Prize cattle stood patiently beneath shaded tents. Horse breeders polished saddles until they gleamed. Rows of preserves sparkled in glass jars beneath morning light. When Thad placed his modest wheel of goat cheese among entries from established dairies, several competitors exchanged amused glances. One man muttered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Goat cheese. What's next? Cactus butter? Laughter followed. Thad ignored it. Muriel whispered quietly. You've gotten good at that. At what? Not answering people who underestimate you. I've had practice. Judging began shortly after noon. The temperature climbed steadily. Canvas tents trapped the afternoon heat until the air felt almost impossible to breathe. Several butter entries softened noticeably. A few young cheeses began sweating around their edges. The judges worked carefully from one table to the next. When they finally reached Thad's entry, one elderly judge frowned thoughtfully. This one hasn't changed. Another leaned closer. It should have. The cheese remained remarkably firm despite the heat. The lead judge sliced through the wheel. A clean cut. No crumbling. No excess moisture. He sampled a small piece before silently handing slices to the remaining judges. For nearly a minute, nobody spoke. Finally, one judge smiled. Balanced. Another nodded. Nutty. A little sweet. The oldest judge looked directly at Thad. How long did you age this? Just over 7 weeks. The judge raised his eyebrows. It tastes like something far older. By evening, the results were announced. 3rd place. 2nd place. The crowd applauded politely. Then the announcer cleared his throat. First prize for artisan dairy. A pause. Thaddeus Mercer. Silence swept across the pavilion. Several ranchers looked genuinely confused. The same men who had laughed at the auction stared at each other in disbelief. Thad walked quietly to the platform. He accepted the ribbon with the same calm expression he had worn while buying 37 unwanted goats. No celebration. No boast. Only gratitude. As he stepped down, Silas Penrose stopped him. I owe you an apology. There isn't any need. There is. Silas extended his hand. I judged those goats by their condition. He smiled sadly. And I judged you by mine. Thad shook his hand firmly. We've all done that before. The following morning, wagons began arriving at the Mercer Ranch. Some visitors wanted to taste the award-winning cheese. Others wanted to buy goats. A few simply wanted to know how he had done it. One rancher finally asked the question everyone had been wondering. What exactly is your secret? Thad looked toward the hillside where the herd grazed peacefully among wild herbs and limestone outcrops. He smiled. There isn't one. The man frowned. There has to be. No. It's patience. Healthy animals. Good pasture. And paying attention. Muriel stood nearby, smiling quietly. She knew the answer was completely honest. There had never been a miracle. Only a cowboy willing to notice what everyone else had overlooked. And as more wagons rolled through the ranch gate beneath the warm autumn sun, both of them realized something extraordinary. The little herd that everyone had mocked wasn't just changing one ranch. It was beginning to change the entire valley. The first snow of November settled lightly over Cedar Bluff, covering the rocky hills in a blanket of white. Inside the creamery, the shelves were no longer half empty. Dozens of carefully aged cheese wheels rested in neat rows, each one marked by date, pasture, and season. What had begun as a notebook full of failed experiments had grown into a craft built on patience. Thad Mercer still started every morning the same way. Before stepping into the creamery, before speaking with customers, before checking the books, he walked the goat pasture. One by one, he inspected the herd that everyone else had abandoned. He knew every animal by sight. The old doe that had been the first to drink from his canteen. The limping buck that now guarded the younger goats. The timid twins born during the autumn rains. To everyone else, they were livestock. To Thad, they were the reason everything had changed. One chilly afternoon, 3 wagons rolled into the ranch yard carrying ranchers from neighboring counties. Among them was Barrett Colson, one of the loudest men at the auction months earlier. He removed his hat before speaking. I've come to apologize. Thad looked up from repairing a fence rail. For what? For laughing. I figured you would. Barrett smiled awkwardly. I also came to ask if you'd sell me breeding stock. Thad leaned against the fence. I could, but I'd rather teach you how to care for them first. The rancher blinked. You'd help me after the way I treated you? Thad shrugged. If your herd improves, the whole valley improves. Barrett had expected a price. Instead, he received an invitation. The following Saturday, More than 20 ranchers gathered at the Mercer Ranch. Rather than guarding his methods like a secret, Thad walked them through every step. He explained rotational grazing, native forage, shade placement during summer heat, clean water sources, patient milking, proper sanitation, slow aging. Muriel demonstrated careful handling of fresh milk, explaining how cleanliness mattered far more than expensive equipment. By sunset, notebooks were filled with observations instead of rumors. People left understanding that success had never been hidden. It had simply required attention. Winter settled across the territory, but business continued to grow. General stores placed standing orders. Hotels along the railroad purchased weekly deliveries. Travelers began asking specifically for Mercer Ridge cheese. The tiny creamery soon needed expanding. Neighbors volunteered timber. Carpenters donated spare days between jobs. Even Silas Penrose spent a week helping raise new walls. When Thad tried to pay him, the old rancher refused. "I already got paid." The day I stopped believing every mistake was permanent. One snowy evening, after the last workers had gone home, Muriel remained inside the warm creamery organizing records. She looked around at the bustling operation. "It doesn't really belong to one person anymore." Thad nodded. "It belongs to everyone who believed after they stopped laughing." She smiled softly. I received another letter. He knew which one. The Dairy College in Chicago had written again, offering her a prestigious teaching position. "It's everything you've worked toward," he said. "It is." Silence settled between them. Finally, she folded the letter and slipped it back into her satchel. "They're asking me to teach people how to build communities." She looked around the room. "I think I'm already doing that." Thad lowered his eyes. "I hoped you'd stay." "I know." She stepped closer. "I was hoping you'd ask." For the first time in many years, the quiet cowboy found himself without words. Instead, he reached for her hand. That answer was enough. 5 years passed. The hills surrounding Cedar Bluff looked different now. Where abandoned pasture had once stretched across the valley, healthy goat herds grazed among native grasses. Small family dairies dotted the countryside. Young ranchers no longer believed success depended only on cattle. The annual agricultural fair added an entirely new category dedicated to artisan cheeses. Visitors traveled from hundreds of miles away to taste products that had earned national recognition. The town that had once been known only as another dusty stop on the frontier had become famous for craftsmanship. Whenever reporters asked where the movement had begun, every rancher pointed toward the same modest ranch at the edge of Cottonwood Ridge. One summer afternoon, a group of schoolchildren toured the creamery. Near the entrance hung a simple wooden frame. Inside it rested a faded receipt. 37 goats, $2. One little visitor frowned. "Why keep that old paper?" Thad smiled. "Because it's easy to remember success." He pointed toward the receipt. "It's harder to remember where it started." The children listened quietly. Most people thought those goats had no value. They weren't wrong because the goats were perfect. They were wrong because they stopped looking. He glanced through the window where the herd grazed peacefully beneath the afternoon sun. Sometimes the greatest opportunity arrives looking like everyone else's problem. As evening settled over Mercer Ridge, lanterns glowed inside the expanded creamery while wagons lined the road waiting for their weekly orders. Neighbors chatted like old friends. Families shared meals. Music drifted from the barn after another successful market day. Muriel stood beside Thad on the porch overlooking the hills. "Do you ever think about that auction?" she asked. He laughed quietly. "Every day. If you hadn't raised your hand, I wouldn't have found this life." She squeezed his hand. "Neither would I." Together they watched the goats disappear over the hillside as the sun painted the Wyoming sky in shades of amber and crimson. The valley had been transformed, not by luck, nor by a miracle, but by one simple decision to see worth where everyone else saw failure. And long after people forgot the price of the goats, they remembered the lesson they had taught. The richest harvests often begin with the things the world is too quick to discard.